In this lecture, we're going to be talking about the nerve impulse, or the action potential. In the previous lecture, prior to this one, we talked about the resting membrane potential, kind of the circumstances that prepare a neuron to have an action potential. In this particular lecture, we're going to put those pieces into action to show how the conditions of the resting membrane potential ultimately help trigger and potentiate the action potential. Prior to the 1950s, scientists were super curious about how neurons carry the message. They knew that a message was being transmitted, that chemicals were being utilized, but they really didn't know what it looked like or what controlled it. In 1952, Hodgkin and Huxley, who actually won the Nobel Prize for this work, used the giant axon of the squid. So a squid has an axon that is so large that you can dissect it out and plop it into a petri dish, which is what they did. Then they used two electrodes. One was a recording electrode, which was placed in the actual axon, and the other was placed on the outside, which is called a grounding electrode. Both of them were placed or attached to what's called an oscilloscope that measures changes in electrical current or voltage over time. And so you have to keep in mind that this change in voltage is not the kind of current or electricity that you would see in the wires of your house. It is very small. Normally voltage is measured in volts, but because this was such a small change, it's actually being measured in millivolts. And because it happens so quickly, the action potential, what you're looking at in time is actually counting in milliseconds, not seconds, right? So there's 1,000 milliseconds in 1 second. So that's how fast the action potential occurs. When they attached these electrodes and took a look at the oscilloscope, here's what they saw. Kind of a flat line over time at roughly -70 millivolts. Okay, this is the resting membrane potential, which we've talked about, and we've talked about the factors that contribute to the resting membrane potential. So now they were interested in determining what would happen if they added current to it. When they attached a stimulating electrode, so this stimulating electrode adds current or change in voltage. What they saw in the recording electrode in a really, really super fast blip was this massive increase in membrane potential or change in membrane potential. And so they ran a series of experiments, and this is what they kind of observed. So at rest, when there's no stimulation occurring, the resting membrane potential is at -70 millivolts, right? We talked about the fact that it's a -70 millivolts. Then they applied a stimulating current to the axon and saw a small change in membrane potential. They added larger stimulation, a larger current, and saw an even bigger blip. They increased the stimulation to a larger current, and they expected to see something that, looks like this, but instead what they saw, my animation's messed up. What they saw was something that looked like this. This is the action potential. What they realized was the point at which the current applied that generated the action potential, rather than a slighter increase in membrane potential, was -62 millivolts. So they changed the membrane from -70 to -62 millivolts, and that generated the action potential. They called this point where the change in membrane potential generated the action potential the threshold of excitation. So the threshold of excitation represents the moment or the charge necessary to change the voltage in the axon to generate an action potential. So what's contributing to this, massive change in membrane potential during the action potential, right? It goes from -70 all the way up to super positive, and then all the way down till it returns back to rest. So they were curious about what might be contributing to this massive change. Enter voltage-gated ion channels. So far we've talked about passive ion channels. These are always open. And I had mentioned voltage-gated ion channels, but we hadn't really talked much about them other than the fact that voltage-gated ion channels require a change in voltage in order for them to open, and prior to that change, they remain closed. So these ion channels are sensitive to changes in voltage. When the membrane changes to a particular value, these ion channels open. Okay, so they are voltage-gated ion channel. The voltage serves as a gate to open the ion channels. When that voltage isn't reached, the gate remains closed. Both sodium and potassium have voltage-gated ion channels. That means they have ion channels specifically for sodium and so there are two separate voltage-gated channels, one for sodium and one for potassium, and both of them are gated at different values. So the threshold to open sodium voltage-gated channels is at the threshold of excitation, -62 millivolts. The threshold, or the value needed to open potassium-gated channels, is a value closer to 0. So the membrane needs to get even more positive than the threshold of excitation before the voltage-gated potassium channels open. So there are some characteristics unique to voltage-gated channels, and here they are. They demonstrate a voltage-gated opening, so there needs to be a change in membrane potential in order for them to open. They demonstrate a time-dependent closing, so there's no condition that closes them, but rather just a period of time. Once that elapses, the channels return to close. And then they also demonstrate something called a refractory period. This refractory period is really important to ensure that the action potential only moves in one direction down the length of the axon towards the axon terminal. So the refractory period is the point at which voltage-gated channels, and this happens soon after they open and they've quote-unquote closed, but they've not completely closed, they enter what's called a refractory period so that no amount of increase in voltage is going to open them again. Okay, so the refractory period represents a point in time during the action potential where you could apply a crap ton of current and that voltage-gated channel will not open. It represents a different situation, different type of closing that's more resistant to opening. Okay, so that all voltage-gated channels demonstrate a refractory period, a time period shortly after it closes where it's resistant to opening until more time has elapsed. And I mentioned the function of the refractory period is to ensure that the action potential only moves in one direction down the length of the axon. So to kind of illustrate the function of the refractory period, here is our lipid bilayer in the axon, and we have inserted voltage-gated sodium channels. We're only going to look at voltage-gated sodium channels because it's easier to do that. Above these, you'll see kind of what is happening to the action potential as it moves down the length of the axon. Okay, so the membrane potential changes to the threshold of excitation for this voltage-gated ion channel. At rest, they're all closed. But when the voltage changes, the voltage-gated channel opens, this first one opens, and it causes sodium to enter, making the inside super, super positive, right? That starts the action potential. These sodium ions that are entering the voltage-gated channel, remember, they're moving down both the electrical and concentration gradient. These sodium channels enter, they're not just going to go down the length of the axon, they're going to go where there's less of them, both up and down, okay? And so when they move down, they're going to change the membrane potential of the next kind of downstream voltage-gated ion channel. That causes these voltage-gated channels to open. the preceding voltage-gated channel enters refractory. This is important because now sodium is entering from this ion channel, the second one here, and is going to go both directions. We want to make sure that the sodium that enters is only going to open the ion channel downstream, the ion channel that's closer to the axon terminal, as opposed to the ion channel that's located closer to the cell body, right? We want to prevent the action potential moving this way. We only want the action potential to move downstream. So let me just erase these lines, and let me pick a different color so you guys can see this a little bit. Okay, so the sodium has entered. The second ion channel is moving in both directions. The first ion channel enters refractory. Sodium entering makes the inside more positive on both sides, but because this preceding ion channel is in refractory, it is resistant to the positive charges that are entering, and instead that causes the next ion channel to open. Sodium enters in both directions, but both preceding ion channels are in refractory. Okay? Sodium enters, only affecting the next ion channel downstream, right? So the next one opens, sodium enters both directions, the preceding two ion channels are in refractory, and notice this first original ion channel returns to the closing state where it's capable of opening, but the sodium doesn't pass or head enough in this direction to change the membrane potential here. So in this manner, the action potential keeps moving down the length of the axon in one direction and never in the other. All right, what is happening in the axon to generate the kind of change that we see in the membrane potential during the action potential? So just a reminder, sodium chloride is located in higher concentration outside the cell. Potassium is located at higher concentrations inside the cell. The inside is slightly more negative compared to the outside, right? And this is a neuron at rest. This is the resting membrane potential. We've now inserted voltage-gated sodium channels, and when the threshold of excitation is reached, these voltage-gated sodium channels open. Sodium has got both diffusion and electrostatic pressure driving it into the cell. So sodium gushes into the cell, both down its concentration and electrical gradient. When sodium enters the cell, it makes the inside of the cell more positive compared to the outside, right? So sodium is a positive ion, so now the inside of the cell becomes more positive compared to the outside. Now, voltage-gated potassium channels reach their threshold, which is a value closer to 0 millivolts, right? Not negative 62, but more positive. And so potassium voltage-gated channels open. Now, potassium not only wants to get away from these positive charges, right? Similar charges repel. Potassium is also moving to an area where there's less of it. So potassium gushes out of the cell down both its concentration and electrical gradient. Okay, so sodium has entered the cell, potassium is leaving the cell. Let's place kind of this diagram onto that graph that I showed you of the action potential earlier. So you can see what's happening that's causing that change in membrane potential to such high positive values, and then what makes it drop. Okay, so just a reminder, these channels close after 1 millisecond, right? They demonstrate a time-dependent closing. Okay, so back to the chart. What I have here is I'm showing you the membrane potential inside and outside the cell over the course of the action potential. I'm also showing you the resting membrane potential, changes in membrane potential over time, and all of this is in milliseconds. Okay, here's the action potential, right? Once the threshold of excitation is reached, you see a sharp increase in membrane potential and then a sharp decrease in membrane potential. It goes past the resting membrane potential and then eventually returns to the resting membrane potential value at negative 70 millivolts. All right, what's happening? So at negative 62 millivolts, we have the threshold of excitation, but at rest, the inside is more negative relative to the outside, right? So before the threshold of excitation is reached, the inside is more negative relative to the outside. Once the threshold of excitation is reached, voltage-gated sodium channels open. Sodium, because it is moving down at its electrical and concentration gradient, both diffusion and electrostatic pressure are driving sodium into the cell. Sodium is rushing into the cell and it's a positive ion. So it makes the membrane potential positive. Okay? So the membrane potential as sodium enters becomes more positive on the inside relative to the outside. At some point, closer to zero, voltage-gated potassium channels open. We talked about the fact that potassium now is going to move out of the cell, both against or because of diffusion and electrostatic pressure, but the membrane potential keeps rising because the amount of sodium entering the cell is so much that the amount of potassium leaving it is not enough to change the charge. So the charge continues to rise, become more positive. After 1 millisecond, voltage-gated sodium channels close. Okay, the time-dependent closing. And potassium continues to leave the cell. Okay, so at this point, sodium can't move. It's stuck inside the cell, but these voltage-gated potassium channels are still open. So as this cation, this positive ion leaves, it makes the inside of the neuron more negative, right? And so now as potassium leaves, the inside of the axon becomes more negative relative to the outside, and it actually gets even more negative relative to the resting membrane potential and eventually returns to rest. Okay, gradually these voltage-gated channels close, so they show a time-dependent closing, but it's not as sudden as the voltage-gated channels. So as potassium continues to leave the cell, the membrane becomes more negative than at rest. Okay, all of this that I've just described, even though it probably took me 2 minutes to describe it, all of this takes 2 milliseconds, right? I mentioned there's 1,000 milliseconds in 1 second. And this is so fast, it takes 2 milliseconds for this to occur. And so your textbook kind of shows you what's happening at these different time points, but I've essentially said the same thing. And your textbook indicates that the threshold of excitation is negative 55, but it doesn't really matter. Different neurons have different thresholds. It's not so important that it's exact, but rather for you to know that there is a threshold of excitation, and at that threshold of excitation, you have voltage-gated sodium channels opening. So at rest, both voltage-gated sodium channels and voltage-gated potassium channels are closed. There's more sodium outside, there's more potassium inside. Once the threshold of excitation is reached, sodium enters the cell in giant quantities. The potassium channels open at a value closer to 0. Potassium is leaving, but it's not enough to counteract the sodium entering in. At 4, sodium channels close. That's a refractory period. And then potassium continues to leave the cell, dropping the membrane potential to values closer to 0, and then the whole system resets at 6 once the potassium channels close. Okay? So here we are at the end of the action potential, right? We talked about all of this. With the end of the action potential, now what? We're at a scenario where there's too much sodium inside and too much potassium outside. This is not a good situation for the neuron to be in order to have another action potential. Sodium needs to get kicked out, potassium needs to get kicked in. So how do the ions get redistributed back to where they were before the action potential occurred? Thank you, sodium-potassium pump. Yay! Okay, so these voltage-gated sodium channels are closed. So are the voltage-gated potassium channels at the end of the action potential. And now we have too much potassium outside, too much sodium inside. Remember, the sodium-potassium pump, for every 2 potassium it pumps in, it pumps out 3 sodium out. So it's constantly moving these ions back to where they need to go at the start of the action potential. Okay, and so for every 2 potassium in, 3 sodium gets kicked out. And we return back to the resting membrane potential. What we haven't talked about, or so what we've talked about so far, is how the action potential moves down a neuron that has no myelin. When a neuron has no myelin, these ion channels are going to open up one at a time, kind of like a domino, right? One is going to open, it's going to cause the activation of the next one, and so on and so forth. So it's a very slow moving process. But many neurons are myelinated, and that increases the speed of conduction of the action potential. In fact, the movement of the action potential in a myelinated neuron, so a neuron that has myelin, is called saltatory conduction. The myelinated portion of the neurons has no ion channels, 0. No voltage-gated or voltage-gated sodium or voltage-gated potassium channels. Voltage-gated sodium and potassium channels only exist at the nodes of Ranvier, those spaces, those bare spaces of the axon that are not covered in in myelin. So when the threshold of excitation is reached at the nodes of Ranvier, the neuron generates an action potential here, right? Sodium rushes in like gangbusters. But rather than just opening the kind of next door voltage-gated sodium channel, sodium, because of the myelin and insulation and no leaks, sodium is driven down to the next node where the threshold of excitation is reached. We're going to move down here. Where the threshold of excitation is reached, these voltage-gated sodium channels open. Sodium at this node gushes in and moves to the next node. In what you're seeing with saltatory conduction is kind of bursts of action potential at each node, and the sodium is driven down to the next node under the myelinated section of the axon. So we're kind of preventing the slow progression of the action potential by covering the axon in insulation and myelin and ensuring that the action potential is kind of being driven down to the next node and hopping, not really hopping, but moving from node to node, as opposed to gradually progressing down the length of the axon, which would happen in an axon that has no myelin. So the speed of conduction increases dramatically with saltatory conduction compared to an axon that has no myelin on it. There are a couple of rules that an action potential follows that we need to discuss, and this is the case in both myelinated and unmyelinated axons. So whether a neuron has myelin or not doesn't matter. These 2 rules apply to all action potentials occurring in an axon. The first one is called all or none law. What this means is that the action potential will either occur if the conditions are met. If the conditions are not met, it will not occur, right? So it's very binary. It either occurs or it doesn't, and that's based entirely on whether the threshold is reached. So you can't have a big axon, a big action potential or a little action potential. Action potentials are all the same size, and they only occur if the conditions are met, the threshold of excitation is reached. If the threshold of excitation is not reached, it will not occur. Once an action potential occurs, it travels down the entire length of the axon. There's no stopping it unless you administer a drug to stop it. There's no stopping it. And the size and intensity of the action potential, that's what AP stands for, of the action potential stays constant. So here, if we were measuring the action potential on a giant axon of the squid, all the way down the length of the axon, you would see that the shape and intensity, the size and intensity of the axon stays constant for the entire length of the axon, right? It doesn't get smaller and smaller as it travels away from the stimulus that triggered it. It maintains its size and intensity. So the all or none law states that the action potential will occur if the conditions are met. If those conditions aren't met, it will not occur. And it also says that the size and intensity of the action potential remains constant for the duration that it moves down the length of the axon. So that's the first law. The second law is called the rate law. Because the action potential does not vary in intensity, we somehow need to convey intensity and behavior with the fact that the action potential is binary, and we do that by changing the rate or frequency of action potentials. So the rate of axon firing, so the rate of the action potential, how many action potentials it has in a given time frame, allows for variation in behavior, graded behavior. So we know that we want to, use more force to lift something heavy, right? And so we want those neurons to fire really, really, really fast compared to when we're lifting something lighter. We want that neuron to have action potentials less frequently. So the frequency of the action potentials determines the strength or intensity of the behavior. And so in this, what you're looking at here is that there's current being injected into that giant squid axon in the petri dish, and then we're measuring the frequency of the action potential that axon has. When we inject a current that's below the threshold of excitation, we don't generate any action potentials. When we generate a current that's slightly above the threshold of excitation, we have relatively frequent action potentials. But if we increase that current, you'll see the rate or the frequency of the action potential increases dramatically. Okay? So that's it for this particular lecture. We've talked about the action potential being generated when the threshold of excitation is reached, at which point voltage-gated sodium channels open. We talked about the fact that sodium entering inside of the axon is what causes the membrane potential to become more positive, ultimately opening voltage-gated potassium channels. The reversal of charge across the membrane, which is the action potential, it travels down the length of the axon, and then the ions are redistributed back to where they're supposed to be based on the actions of the sodium-potassium pump. Myelinated axons travel down, action potentials travel down myelinated axons through saltatory conduction, which increases the speed of the action potential. And action potentials follow two laws. It's the all or none law, which says an action potential will occur or not, and the rate law. The frequency of the action potentials dictates the intensity of the behavior, or we can have the frequency of the action potential represented as an indication of the intensity of the stimulus that's triggering the action potentials. All right, that's it for this lecture.